Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Matt Bagnoli, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Development Officer here at the Fund for American Studies. I am very happy to be with you today and pleased to be able to offer to you, our partners and investors, an opportunity to hear from Anne Bradley, the George and Sally Meyer Fellow for Economic Education and the Fund for American Studies Academic Director. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation, and we will work to get through as many of them as possible in the time that we have. We will not be actively monitoring the chat box moving forward, so please make sure to submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. With that little housekeeping out of the way, I am very pleased to introduce our president, Roger Ream, who is himself a 1976 alumnus of our programs, for a few brief remarks and to introduce our speaker. Roger, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Welcome to all our friends and supporters around the country, even around the world. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for what I'm sure will be a very informative, enlightening, and lively presentation and conversation about a very important topic. Matt asked me if I'd introduce Anne Bradley, our George and Sally Meyer Fellow for Economic Education, which I'm happy to do. Anne first came to our attention at TFAS in 2001 when she was hired by one of our professors to be a teaching assistant at our program in Prague in the Czech Republic. And we've just been so pleased to have her working with us in a more formal role in the last few years as the George and Sally Meyer Fellow. She's been teaching for, I think, over a decade in our classes. We, every semester, every summer, hear from students who've taken her economics and say she has turned on light bulbs in their head and changed their whole understanding of the way the world works by teaching what we like to call the economic way of thinking. So I thought the one thing I would do by way of introducing Anne is to just share with you a passage I came across recently by Václav Havel, who was president, the first real president of the Czech Republic, where Anne was teaching for us. And in his book, Summer Meditations, appropriately, given that we're in the summer here, he wrote a chapter called What I Believe. And he talked about the fact that he once considered himself a socialist, even though he said he wasn't identifying a specific economic theory he believed in. But he said that basically his heart was to the left of center. And he wrote in there, I've always known, despite his heart being left of center, I've always known that the only economic system that works is the market economy, in which everything belongs to someone, which means that someone is responsible for everything. It is a system in which complete independence and plurality of economic entities exist within a legal framework, and its workings are guided by the laws of the marketplace. This is the only natural economy, the only kind that makes sense, the only one that can lead to prosperity, because it is the only one that reflects the nature of life itself. What we find in our teaching with young people who come to us, they really have not taken a course that taught economics and the economic way of thinking in such a way that it explains the way the world works, that it shows that it has the tools for solving economic problems and lifting people out of poverty and promoting human flourishing. So I'm so thrilled now to call on Anne Bradley to offer this terrific presentation to us all. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Roger, and thank you, Matt, for inviting me to do this. It's my pleasure to be here. And this is something that I have found that I've been talking with my students a lot more about, this question about democratic socialism. And so kind of the question I want to go through today, by the way, Matt told me I have about 15 or 17 minutes to talk. And so you know that if you've ever heard an economist speak before, that's really a tough thing to do. So I'm going to do my best, and I really want to leave time for your questions. But I really think that this is a central issue, not just in the United States, but beyond, which is Is democratic socialism a good idea, a good alternative to capitalism? Can it get us more of what we say we want? And for some people, and I think maybe for all of us, we're thinking about equality and equality of opportunity. How do we afford access to people for entrepreneurship and education and these types of things that we know are very important for human flourishing? So these are important questions. And what I want to say from the outset is I'm an economist, that's how I'm trained. And so we're not going to be talking about this in a political way today. We're going to be talking about it in an economic way. And I think that is essential. And what you'll find is that that allows us to kind of break through the ideological fights, right? Because we can do that with people who don't agree with us all day long. But those fights, don't tend to change people's minds, right? So if you've ever had a long extended conversation with people about capitalism versus socialism or government intervention, most people don't go home from those fights and say, wow, you really changed my mind. I'm totally going to change the way I do everything. But I think what economics gives us, as Roger said, we use the phrase, the economic way of thinking a lot at TFAS, because we believe just understanding some fundamental principles can allow us to really understand these questions and ask what is the best economic system to get the most human flourishing for the most number of people. So that's how I'm framing this today. But what I want to share with you and where I want to start is this slide here, which shows us that the trends are really changing. They're changing a lot. So right now you see that the younger generations, millennials, Gen Zers, they are more positive in terms of their opinions about socialism. In some cases, they're more positive about socialism than they are about capitalism. That's if you look over, across the graph for baby boomers, that's not as much true. So the dark green line is people who favor capitalism, and the light green line is people who favor socialism. And this is a pretty recent poll. This was done in 2019, but we've been looking at these polls for at least 10 years, and it seems to be the case that younger generations are more open to the idea of socialism, are more willing to perhaps experiment with it with real politicians. And so here's another poll that came out recently. 70% of millennials say they are likely to vote socialist. Now, of course, what they really do when they get in the voting box is what matters, not what they say they might do. But it's still important, I think, to show us that this is among a generation, this is a large percentage of the population that says, hey, maybe socialism is the way to go. Maybe we need to switch it up. Maybe capitalism has failed us. Now, again, I'm only going to use economics to address that. And I think that's the way to go. I think economics helps us cut through the costs and the benefits, right? That's what economics is about. So, but here we have two very charismatic American politicians, AOC and Bernie Sanders, and they have been very outspoken about, democratic socialism. So if you listen to what they say, they're not saying, hey, we should go back to Stalin, we should, kind of go back to Marx in a direct way, but they are saying, maybe if we have socialism that's democratic, then you don't have to worry about the authoritarian parts, because when people start behaving badly as policymakers, we have a democratic process and democratic institutions that will allow us to kind of get the bad guys out and put newer people in. And so I would say to all of this, if that's true, if democratic socialism is possible, if it will get us better outcomes in terms of more opportunity for people, rising incomes, greater human agency, which promotes human flourishing, then it's something we would want to consider. And so, but what I wanted to think about, or what I have been thinking about, is how did we get here? It's hard to imagine right after Ronald Reagan famously got in front of a microphone and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's hard to imagine that Americans, or anybody else for that matter, would be saying, hey, let's have a new version of socialism. But obviously that was many, many years ago in 1989. And so we're far removed from that. And I think if you weren't alive at the time, then you obviously don't have the memory of the fear of the Cold War, the fear of the spread of communism, these types of things. So I think there's a cool factor that democratic socialism has. One, I already talked about, we have these charismatic politicians who clearly state that they care for the poor. So they're advocating for socialism under the banner of equality and helping the poor. And helping the poor, of course, is something we all want to do. I think then you see, this picture of Che Guevara on a T-shirt, right, which is this idea that, he was a Marxist socialist who wasn't a bad guy. And so it's interesting to me to see that you can, buy t-shirts with his name on them. But again, I think there's a cool factor perhaps to that, but that can only be cool if you don't really understand the history behind what Che did. And he wasn't even one of the worst Marxist dictators. And so that's another thing I want to talk about is, kind of central allocation of economic resources always is associated with more and more violence and coercion. That's not an accident. That's a natural outcome. And then kind of the last thing here is we have people talking about the Nordic model, right? That look, if you look at Sweden and you look at Finland and Norway, et cetera, that these are democratic socialist countries. They have high levels of happiness. They have high levels of economic freedom. People live long and healthy lives there. There's lots of entrepreneurship. So I think there's a couple things going on that are making this this idea of democratic socialism and the possibility of it attractive to people. And so that's has to be first in our mind, is knowing how people are coming to these ideas. But the second thing that we have to do is just really put all the ideas on the table. What is capitalism? What is socialism? What is democratic socialism? And then as economists, all we do is say, among those different economic systems, what is going to have the best outcomes? And we choose accordingly, right? And we want to protect human dignity and we want to protect human rights. So those are our assumptions going into the system. My mentor, Professor Dr. Peter Boettke, who is a long friend and teacher with TFAS, has always said, and he's right, that any economic system rests on moral claims and moral assumptions. And so the claims we want to make are that we believe in human dignity and human productivity. So what are the economic realities we need to start with here? I think there's a couple. One is just we live in a world of scarcity. Resources are not infinite. And that's true whether you're talking about, the limits of your own credit card or bank account, but it's also true in terms of government decision making. Government doesn't have unlimited resources. There's no magic wand. Same with NGOs and charities. We have limits. So that means we have to make decisions and trade-offs. The other idea here that's really important is incentives matter for human decision making. So people have to be motivated to do things. We can't just rely on everybody to be benevolent all the time. And comparative advantage, which is what, kind of the basis for trade, which is this idea that we're all different and the gains from trade are profound for each of us, because if we were left to our own devices, we wouldn't be able to do very much, right? Imagine having to do everything on your own. All the things that are in your pantry, if you had to make them yourself, you wouldn't have anything in your pantry, right? So trade allows us to mutually benefit from one another. And that's why economists generally like trade. More trade is better because it gives you more choices. So Adam Smith, I have a picture of him here. I can't go without showing you a picture of him. He's the father of modern economics. And his insight that stays with us today is, I think it's really what makes him a profound economist, is that he understood individuals, right? He understood the nature, human nature, which is that we're capable of really great things. We're very creative. We can be very productive, but we're also capable of very bad things, and we're selfish. And we have self-interest, and that can go wrong. That can turn into greed. And of course, when we think about socialism or capitalism, we talk about government, we're always going to have to worry about the tendency for greed for people who have power. And so when we talk about democratic socialism, this idea that Adam Smith brought up is really important. But what's his insight? His insight is that in a market economy with property rights, prices, and profits and losses, that individual ambition is mitigated, because you only want to, or you're only going to make a profit if you serve other people. So this is why Adam Smith is still so important to us today as economists. He understood the power of markets. They provided self-interested people with incentives to serve one another, to innovate, to help one another, because again, that's the only way you can gain a profit. Thinkers that came after Adam Smith that I think are really important for this democratic socialism debate, it made very clear, and this is Ludwig von Mises and his student F.A. Hayek, who engaged in what we call the socialist calculation debate, which was raging in the 20th century, was among academics and others, was this idea that the calculation, economic calculation, in other words, who is going to do what, is impossible under socialism. And the reason for that is this phrase right here: we don't know what the optimal allocation of resources is. And we can't know that prior to exchange. So it's the act of exchanging, buying and selling, that helps us know What is the most productive use of our scarce resources in any given moment? Now, the problem with socialism versus capitalism is that in socialism, by definition, we have collective ownership of the means of production. And I want us to be very clear when you guys are talking, to your friends and your colleagues, it's really important to be clear on the definitions. And I think if we go back to that first poll, when you're asking Gen Zers and millennials, is socialism a good idea? But then you ask them to define socialism and define capitalism, you're going to get a lot of different answers. And most of them are going to be incorrect. And the reason is because we've used these as either kind of slurs against people we don't like or compliments, but we're not using the economic meaning of the word. So the economic definition of socialism, government owns the means of production. The economic definition of capitalism, private ownership of the means of production. Very different, right? So when the government owns the means of production, the management of resources comes from the top and is pushed down to individuals. The exact opposite happens under capitalism. Private individuals own the means of production. And so private individuals have to say, I have this plot of land, right? I have some natural resources. I have the brain in my head. Human capital, by the way, is the most important element of capital. And you have to decide what you're going to do with it. And what motivates those decisions as an individual? Well, I want to make a profit. Well, I'm not going to make a profit in a market unless I give people what they want. So see, the motivations in capitalism are that you have to figure out what other people want and give it to them. And there's a lot of people competing to do that. So you have these pressures to be effective, low cost, etc. Under socialism, we have it, it's kind of management by decree, right? It's centralized. And so rather than firms making decisions, government bureaus and technocrats make decisions. And so that gets enforced by management. So if you're a student of history, you know how this went under Mao's China. You understand the results of this under Stalin and Lenin's Soviet Union, which is that people stood in line for bread and the grain for that bread rotted in the silos. And the reason it did is because we didn't have prices, property rights, profits and losses. So the cornerstone of all of this is private property. Without it, you can't have a market for production. And without a market for the means of production, you can't establish monetary prices. And without monetary prices, we don't know how to use different capital goods, right? Land, labor, machinery. We don't know how to combine them. So this is the key economic point and the distinction between socialism and capitalism. So note, at no point here have I made any ideological claim. In fact, the claim I'm making is based on my assumption here that all human beings are self-interested, right? So we have to embrace an economic system that takes people as they are, not as we wish they would be. And unfortunately, under socialism, that system requires people to divorce themselves from their self-interest and submit themselves to the technocrats in the hopes that the technocrats have their best interests at heart. And so again, this is kind of why I make a point to discuss Adam Smith. His insight was not to get a productive economy doesn't require us to transform every human being into, a benevolent altruist, but rather we can take people as they are, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And we can use incentives to get those people to behave cooperatively and productively all the time. Now, today in the debates, most serious people aren't saying, let's bring back Stalin, right? Because everybody knows that was there were devastating human consequences. Many millions of people died under that experiment. But people are saying, what about the Nordic model? The Nordic model seems to be socialist, but it's democratic. So maybe it provides this model that we can embrace in the United States and beyond for a country that's more just and more fair, but also allows us to be wealthy, have private property and things like this. And so I think that the way, we have to address this is on its face, are the Nordic models examples of democratic socialism? I'm going to tell you the bottom line right up front, which is the answer is no. In countries like Sweden, Denmark, Finland, right? Bernie Sanders very famously said, let's be more like Denmark. And I think what he was meaning there is, they have more wealth redistribution, they have more maybe equity, they have larger social welfare programs. But if we look at Sweden and Finland and Denmark, and here's a map of economic freedom. Economic freedom is a database that we use to measure economic opportunity in countries. And look here at the Nordic models. There's some of the most, or the Nordic countries are some of the most free economies in the world, which means the government doesn't own the means of production. So we cannot say they are socialist. So I think that's a mistake. Government technocrats in Sweden aren't telling people what to do. You know, you're going to raise cows, you're going to launch our space program, you're going to be a scientist. That's not how it works. In fact, if you look at data, the Nordic countries are some of the most innovative economies in the world. Look here, you have Sweden and Finland and Denmark among the top. And how are they innovative? They're innovative because entrepreneurs are free to experiment and discover, right? And that's how problems get solved. So what is different about these countries? Well, they have much larger tax bases, and they're also much smaller economies. And so I would not call these countries, you know, examples of democratic socialism, but I would say they're social democracies, and they're small. So for example, Denmark has about, I don't know, 5 million people or slightly under. So this is a small country, largely homogenous. And so that's the kind of political will that you're going to have to get for people to vote for a 45% tax to GDP ratio, which is quite high compared to the United States. And so I think what you see in these Nordic models are examples of countries that do have a lot of economic freedom, but they also do have a lot of wealth redistribution. And so what the economist would say is maybe Denmark and Sweden and Finland could be even better, right? Even freer, even richer, even more innovative if they would roll back some of that welfare state. Because unfortunately, the welfare state not only does public activity crowd out private individual activity because of that high tax rate, right? It's taking dollars out of people's pockets and giving it to the government to redistribute. But the other problem we see, and we see this in the United States, which I would classify as a mixed economy, is that government tax expenditures are usually given to the rich. So, you know, kind of people vote to line their own pockets. And so large welfare states open up opportunities for a lot more cronyism. We might call it rent seeking, but that's what economists tend to refer to that as. And so the problem is that that type of system gets co-opted by the already wealthy, and the people, you know, at the bottom of the income distribution who can't hire rich lawyers and lobbyists and things like this, they get left out of that process. So I actually think that in mixed economies where you have a lot of corporate welfare, you have the opportunity for less justice and less equality rather than more. And so, you know, kind of just want to end here and happy to answer any questions you have. This is the key. This is the linchpin here, is that the reason that democratic socialism is impossible is, number one, because we can't possibly know the best allocation of scarce resources. Markets allow us to discover that through voluntary bargaining, voluntary entrepreneurship. Nobody's being forced to do it. So if you're going to take that away, prices, property rights, profits and losses, if you're going to remove the very things that make markets work, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to put somebody in charge. They're going to make up prices. The prices are going to be arbitrary. They're going to enforce the prices, right? And so the problem that you get is that if people don't fall in line with what you tell them to do, what do you have to do? You have to use more force. So I think Venezuela today provides an example. We're watching it happen. It's tragic. It's an unnecessary tragedy, which is that as economic allocation has been commandeered by the state, they necessarily have become less democratic and more authoritarian. So I would say that democratic socialism, it sounds good on paper maybe, but I actually think in reality it is an impossibility. Because when you remove the very things that make markets work and give people freedom and autonomy, you necessarily have to ramp up the force. And so I think what we see in Venezuela is a feature of the system, not a bug of the system. And that's why I think we need to fight for more economic freedom. So I'll stop there, and Matt, you can let me know if there's questions. Happy to take those.
Thank you, Anne. That was very informative in a very short period of time. We do have a number of questions in the queue so far, and as a reminder to folks who are watching our webinar today, if you would like to ask Anne a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit the questions there. But our first question, Anne, is going to come from Jackie, actually. And she asks, I'm going to put you on the spot here. And if you only had 2 minutes to share about why democratic socialism is bad with a student, what would you say to them? Gave us a great explanation here. How do you drill it down when you've only got a few minutes?
So in 2 minutes, I would speak very fast so I could get as much in there as possible. But I would say, if I would boil down what I said today, I would say it's not an ideological fight that I would want to have. It's an economic question. Which system allows the most people to flourish? And so I would say the reason that democratic socialism is not the answer is because the only way we can become rich, if you will, is by people experimenting through entrepreneurship. And socialism takes that opportunity away and gives all the power to the people at the top. And necessarily that means some people are going to be excluded. And moreover, there's going to be a lot of violence. And so then I would maybe suggest just an example or two, like let's talk about Venezuela today. And then maybe I would say, let that open the conversation. But I think those are the key ideas here.
Hi, that sounds great. So we have some really good questions today, and some questions that I think are going to be hard, which is exciting. People are really digging in on the issue. So Anne, our next question comes from Herb, and he says, based on experience, how likely is it that a democratic socialist government soon becomes authoritarian, canceling elections, banning parties, free press, free religion? What are the ramifications of it?
Yeah, so I guess part of the question is about, the timeline. So, I think this idea that there's some example of a democratic socialism out there is I'm not sure that I buy that, but I think just take the democratic off and say, there's this kind of country or society who's growing more socialist, meaning what we said before, the government is making economic resource allocation decisions. And as they increasingly do that, they're necessarily going to have to do things that you're saying, which is cancel elections, take over the press, take over the internet, destroy religious freedoms. And so I think if you look around, that doesn't take very long to happen because authoritarianism requires shutting down independent thinking, and it requires shutting down criticism of the government. And so things like free elections, right, that makes the government vulnerable. So I don't think it necessarily takes very long for when the government starts to give out, all these things for free. We love the word free, by the way. I have little kids and I don't even let them use the word free because I'm trying to teach them everything costs you something. Even if the government gives you, here's your brand new car. So that money came for that car somewhere, and that money is destined to run out when we do it that way. So I think, Herb, the answer to your question is it doesn't take that long for a government to, when they're starting to make these economic decisions that are authoritarian and involve direct planning, then the force follows very closely behind that. And, look at modern day China as an example. I think they're moving, we hope they're moving in the other direction towards more freedom. And they've shown that they are moving towards greater economic freedom, but they're not there yet. And what's the government doing? They're hanging on for dear life by controlling everything they can. And that's very typical behavior. Good question. Thank you.
That's a great answer. I also like hearing about that. I was trying to teach my daughter about taxes the other day using Twizzler bites. My 6-year-old, she kind of got it. Which actually leads us to our next question from Roy. I'm really enjoying these. Is taxation theft? And if not, what are the limitations on it?
Oh gosh, this is a great question. So here's the thing. I mean, by definition, it's taking something from you that you earned, right? So it is. What are the limits to it? I think, of course, that depends on who you ask. But I'm just going to give the most charitable answer I can, which is if we could just stick to the Constitution and look at what the role of a proper limited government is and tax accordingly, I think the tax rate would be far lower than what it is today. And I think that you could certainly eliminate some taxes altogether. I'm a citizen of Virginia, and lots of people who work for TVAS are too, so they can attest to this, but it's very expensive to be a car owner in Virginia. So you have to pay taxes when you buy the car, you have to pay yearly taxes on the car, you have to get new license plate stickers there's all these things you have to do, inspections. So they're finding all these ways to tax your property. I think a lot of that stuff would go away if we would just narrow the scope and the size of the state. But here's the problem, and it's not just a problem for the US. There's something called Wagner's Law in economics, which we look at and we say as national income grows, which means as we get richer across all countries that we measure this, also taxes and government spending go up. So I think part of that is, Roy, our unrealistic expectations of what government can do for us. So that comes down to kind of some of the fundamental things we were talking about today, which is how do we kind of narrow the scope to what only government can do, right? The essential functions, and then let entrepreneurs do the rest. And I think that's the right answer. What that looked like and how do we get there is a harder question.
That's great. Give you one that's a little bit easier this time. This one comes from Richard Salvatierra, and I will just say to everybody on the call, I think Richard wins the award for joining us from the furthest away location. He is actually a TFAS alum in Peru. So he is joining us from Peru today. So his question is just, democratic socialism is really just a fancy way to disguise the hard reality that socialism equals communism, right?
I mean, so we could be giving the people who are calling for democratic socialism the benefit of the doubt and say, maybe they really do want to help people. But I do think, and maybe they do, I'm not going to question that, but I think what they're advocating for is a veiled cover for socialism. Because if you listen to what the people who are democratic socialists are asking for, it's not reducing the size and scope of the state, but greatly increasing it. And so I think that, where does that ultimately get us? It gets us back to the question that was just asked, which is, if you're going to start doing that, the government's going to get a lot bigger, and it's going to invade more aspects of our life by telling us what to do, when to do it, how to behave, what we can think. And so, the reason I say democratic socialism isn't possible because socialism can't ever be democratic. So socialism is just socialism, right? And I think, I think reading Hayek's The Road to Serfdom is really important work to kind of reflect on as we, and it's historically very important, but very important in terms of where we find ourselves today. So I think we have to be careful not to get on that path. But yeah, I do. I think what they're advocating for is actually a lot more government and a lot more control over private lives and private business.
Great answer. And our next question comes from Philip. He frames it as, seems that incentives and competition are key factors in ranking socialism below capitalism. Can these be described in semi-quantitative terms as to their importance?
Okay, I'm going to give this a shot. I think, I think what you're saying here is that the idea of incentives and competition, those ideas are what make capitalism work. And maybe that's what you were saying, right? So that and that goes back to understanding our nature, right? We need to be incentivized or induced to do things that are helpful and productive and to find new combinations of scarce resources. So how would you quantify those things? I think you look at, if you remember that index I showed, which was just looking at innovation levels. I think another way to look at economic freedom data. I'm not as big of a fan as looking at GDP, but we have a lot of that data, so we can look at that too. Doing business index, political freedom measures. And so I do think that there's empirical ways we can measure societies that either increase competition, incentives for discovering better ways of doing things, and societies that don't do that right now. And so, yeah, I do think there's a lot of empirical ways to kind of check what we've talked about, the theory of what I've kind of presented today. So yeah, I do think, and there's a lot of data out there and a lot of empirics that would help us do that.
That's great. Thank you. And again, folks, we've got a couple more minutes. So if you've got questions, please make sure you get them in. We have a couple in the queue right now. And this one's real quick and easy for you, from Don. Actually, now that I say this, where can we buy your books or see your lectures?
Well, and Matt can help you with this. So we have at TFAS, I did a short podcast on this, which you can listen to, but you can also, I think it's downloadable, right, Matt? So we kind of translate it into a small book. So it's based on this. Also happy to make this PowerPoint available if you want it. And then there's kind of on other things I've written, you can look on Amazon. So I've been really interested in income inequality in general and economic development, thinking about capitalism. So you can find those things on Amazon as well. Thank you for asking. And then I think there's probably lots of recorded talks on YouTube. I'm not sure if I would recommend them all, but you could look there too.
That's great. And I will just say for everybody on the line, we are recording this. You will be able to get a link of this once it is finished, as well as if you have any questions about receiving resources, you can email me. My email is matt, M-A-T-T, @tfas.org. Also in the registration emails you got. So our next question, I'm actually gonna paraphrase two questions because we've gotten a couple here about Great Britain. And so there's been a lot of back and forth between labor and conservative for a long time. Elections and free speech go on. And then at the same time, adding on to that, how can you privatize, and how did England or the UK privatize certain industries that had been nationalized previously?
Yeah, so these are great questions. And I would describe Great Britain very much, similarly to how I would describe the United States. It's a mixed economy, right? So most of us don't live in pure communism or pure capitalism. I think most of us live in mixed economies of a variety of ranges. I also think the other thing to keep important is that Great Britain is much smaller than the United States. So getting the political will to transform privatization of things that have been nationalized or changing the status of unions in a country. I really think that policy is always downstream from culture and ideas. And so I think that's where change has to start, is we have to really have an ideas revolution. And that's why I'm very passionate about this kind of democratic socialism question, because I think this is where the new generation is latching on to this idea that it's possible, they didn't live through the Cold War, et cetera. And this would be true in the UK today, right? If you're, kind of 25, you weren't there for what Margaret Thatcher was doing. And so I think you need a revolution in ideas that starts at the grassroots level. And then think you need elected leaders that will really stand up for that. And that is the hard part. That's very tough, because as we know, the lure of politics, once you get in there, is to get reelected. And to get reelected, you need to keep a lot of special interest groups happy. And so that's why we don't seem to see big privatizations or denationalizations. And so this is a line of economics that we study a lot called public choice, kind of the economics of politics. So I think the best bet is to not get there in the first place. But when you're there, I think you need a grassroots sea change, a paradigm shift. Because policy is always downstream from culture, and so we got to change culture if we're going to change these policies. But I think that these things are possible. I think that we've seen it before. We can see it again. I don't think we can have naive optimism, but I think we can be grounded in the possibility that if the right things get put into place, they could change in the direction of more freedom.
That's a great answer. I'm gonna just let everybody know this is gonna be our last question. We're nearing up on the 45-minute mark, and I have generally tried to promise everyone to keep these timely. Our last question is gonna combine the two questions that are in the queue, and so the first one is, do you think the baby boomer generation has set a precedent for the Gen Z and millennials? The Gen Z and millennials' interest in democratic socialism, given how the boomers have become so dependent on the federal government through Social Security and Medicare? And then to close us out, is democratic socialism inevitable in the US?
So to answer the first question, I think, it's really possible that, yes, that's true. I think the boomers, there's a lot of government spending that occurred in that generation. I think there's also, as you mentioned, these are two very large unfunded liabilities. Social Security is, insolvent. And so maybe that's, I hate to say it this way, but maybe that's the good news, is that, to witness the bottom falling out of those programs, maybe forces the younger generation to accept the privatization of those things, or to force the privatization of those things. I mean, I can tell you that my husband and I are not banking on Social Security, and we're certainly not teaching our children to rely on that. They're going to have to learn to save at very young ages. And that's good, right? Taking private responsibility. So maybe the failure of those things, which took a long time, of course, will change those attitudes. But I think that's possible. The other question, is it inevitable in the United States? I mean, I don't think so. I don't think anything's inevitable. I think we can always turn things around and always change things. But my biggest worry in the United States, if you look at the numbers in economic freedom, is the growth in the regulatory burden. I think this is a real problem for the United States. I think we have lots of regulations that are very expensive to comply with, and those are growing. And so I think those things alone make it hard. I like, to think about entrepreneurship as starting at a very individual level. So think about some business you run out of your home, a little baby micro entrepreneur. Those can only grow into big things if we allow business to grow. And I think if there's so many regulations that are burdening people, we're not going to get there. And so I don't think democratic socialism is inevitable, but I do think that those types of regulatory problems, plus just government spending alone, I think is another big problem. We're seeing it grow. It's grown absolutely with a very clear trend over the last 100 years. And so if we don't stop that, we are already going to pay consequences. But, maybe in the consequences coming due, that's when we get the culture change, because people see we can't do this anymore. Social Security doesn't work. It's taking a pandemic for us to really rethink, what is public education going to look like? So sometimes the crisis, unfortunately, is where you get people to entertain new possibilities. And I think we have to hope that that's what we push for in the future, and it gets real reform, like I said, in the direction of more freedom, more economic freedom.
That's a great answer, Ann. With that, we're going to finish up the webinar. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. And let me express all of our gratitude that you were able to join us today. I'm certain that the listeners on the line would agree we need more people to hear this message about democratic socialism. And for a lot of you who aren't as familiar with TFAS, that's actually what we strive to do every day here. Everyone on the call today just got a small taste of what our students experience every day in our programs. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of students working through a variety of programs at the high school and college level, teaching them about economics and the free markets. We are working very, very hard to ensure that the next generation of leaders are champions for liberty and free markets. And more importantly, we didn't let this recent pandemic slow us down. In just a few short weeks, our program team did yeoman's task to take programs that are normally hosted in person in Washington, D.C., as where they have economics classes with professors just like Ann, as well as take part in experiential learning through internships, where they, again, get to see the reality of how free markets and liberty are so beneficial to our country. Our webinar today will be available to watch on demand. If you would like to share it with your family or friends, please email me at matt@tfas.org. Again, matt@tfas.org, or in the email you received in your registration email, and I will make certain you receive the link. In closing, I'd like to offer a special thanks to our investors who have joined with us today. Without your support, we would not be able to accomplish our mission. And it is because of your dedication to TFAS and the cause of liberty that we can impact tens of thousands of lives every year. Roger, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I thank you, Ann Bradley, for the tremendous impact you're having on the lives of the students in our programs. And thank you all for your support of our programs. We pledge to keep up the fight for economic liberty in all that we do. Thank you.